Singapore. I saw a recommendation by several people that I follow on Substack after a visit from Singapore, and he has some thoughts called Singapore Urbanism Thoughts from a Visit to the Solarpunk City. And I've visited Singapore once for about 7 days, maybe a little longer. This was when I was working in corporate America. I managed a team of four wonderful people, happened to be women. It left such an incredible impression on me. And as I was reading through this person's article, made me kind of reminisce myself, and I really enjoyed reading the article. And like many things that I've come across with, especially people with economics background, they get some parts right and some of the key parts wrong. And I wanted to kind of talk through it and share my views on these observations. So the first thing that really strikes you about Singapore is how incredibly rich it is, and that's correct. That's exactly what I noticed when I landed at the airport. Actually, I would say it probably started as I was boarding the plane from London, Singapore Airlines, on the direct flight to Singapore. And how rich is Singapore? Well, if you guys follow me and know a little bit about economics and history and culture, well, you know it's one of the richest, if not the richest. And here he makes a point that it's on average it is richer than the United States. And how is that possible? Why is that? And he goes into a bit. He had a similar experience I did. You land in Singapore, that Changi airport, and I too noticed this right away. What a gorgeous airport! I don't recall seeing this. Looks like a generated image, but maybe not. But it did feel a little bit like this. It's sort of a cross between a luxurious private lounge and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And I can't remember seeing a lot of generated videos, pictures of Babylon, but yeah, I could imagine that. One of the things I noticed, not aesthetically, was when I went to the baggage claim. All the bags came out with the handle, the wheels facing back towards the belt, all the handles facing up, so you could just grab it right away. And it felt like it was perfectly spaced out, as if some person, I can't imagine it was 100% automated, because then why wouldn't some of the best airports in the United States have that? And I've traveled to all of that. I haven't seen this yet, but all the bags were lined up perfectly, handles out, you just grab it and go. What a beautiful experience. I recorded that video. I just don't know where it is on my phone, but it's a great experience to land in Changi and sets you up for the rest of your time in Singapore. And I would say it doesn't disappoint. He mentions how built up Singapore is, and that's definitely an obvious observation for people that even haven't been to Singapore. You just see floors and floors of buildings, and it's not just regular looking buildings. I mean, he makes a point that's elaborate and futuristic exteriors and spotless manicured grounds. Yeah, one of the things you'll also notice is the greenery, and which is this very next thing he mentions. You just see plants oozing out of the buildings. It was kind of gorgeous. I mean, I remember looking at old Popular Mechanics magazines when I was a kid 30 years ago and seeing this kind of utopia drawn up, saying what the future could look like in America, in the in the world, or in other galaxies. And that is the feeling I got when I walked uh, and drove through Singapore. And even our own building that we worked in was a gorgeous, gorgeous building. Had trees inside the building, had trees outside the building, had trees in the courtyard. It was just quite nice. And here's showing more examples. Again, everything I noticed as well. And he's calling it part of a solar punk aesthetic. I'm not familiar with that term. He does provide a link here. But yeah, I could go along with that. And of course, Noah goes into a bit more detail on what other benefits, of course, shade and pollution, and it does make it look more inviting and comfortable. And I'm sure those are all good reasons to have. And how can you do this? Well, he makes the point again that it's because Singapore is really, really rich. It's expensive to plant trees 14 or more stories high in the air, water them and take care of them and manicure them. And a third point he mentioned is effectively zero bugs in a tropical heat and humidity location. Now, when he said this, I was taken aback because I remember getting bit by mosquitoes in my hotel room, um, walking around in the evening uh, from the office or going out, enjoying the air at. I remember eating at a brewery out on the east side, but then I had to take a minute and think. With my experiences in Houston, in North Houston, in Conroe, around Lake Conroe, boy, that yeah, compared to that experience, you're right. There was pretty much zero bugs. Maybe I got a few bites during my whole trip, but in respect to Houston, I guess I should have expected more. I don't know how you can, what evidence there is of Singapore slaughtering all its bugs, because I don't remember seeing trucks of fog trucks driving around the city and men and women carrying around sprayers like you do, like you see in parts of Houston or even here in Tucson during monsoon season. I didn't see any of that. And I was pretty sure I was looking out for that and I didn't see it. But you're right. I should have seen more bugs than before. So here we go to the meat of it, where maybe we start having some disagreements. He tries to, how did Singapore get so rich? He makes a point to model Ireland, which I've also visited this summer, so I can speak a little bit to it. But he says it's a very small English speaking country, great education system, tons of high skilled immigration, and an industrial policy that focuses relentlessly on attracting foreign direct investment. Is that why Singapore is so rich? What made Singapore adopt these policies? Is it because US is the main investor? So if US puts their investments in any other country or city state, would you see another Singapore spring up? It says it's not a model that can easily be copied by larger countries, since the FDI has to come from somewhere. Really? Does it really have to? Can it not be replicated by larger companies? Singapore has executed this small country game plan with amazing skill. Yeah, that's possible. Yeah, like I said, team I managed in Singapore, I it was such a joy, and I've never been able to experience that same level of uh, management as I did then. Upholding racial diversity, maintaining extremely low crime is even more impressive. But is this really that it takes to be successful? To be an English speaking country with a great education system, import a lot of high skilled immigration, attracting foreign direct investment? Is that always the recipe? That's pretty replicable if that's all it takes. Abundant housing is one of the reasons why Singapore is rich. Is that the right causal effect? You're rich and so you have abundant housing, and well, he starts to get into it, talking about how Singapore owns most of the land, and that is why there's no contradiction between using your home as a place to live and using it to build wealth. And here's some of the more Keynesian view of housing, to put it nicely. And he's saying the Singapore's HDB system, and HDB is mentioned above, but you can read along, is an absolute amazing solution to the housing problems that afflict most other nations. Basically, the government owning and developing the land allows it to control housing supply so as to produce abundant, affordable housing and predictable slow appreciation. Is that so? Ireland, with its notorious housing shortage, is at risk of losing the pharmaceutical industry to Singapore, its main rival for American pharmaceutical foreign direct investment, simply because Singapore can build housing and Ireland cannot. If I were in charge of Ireland, I would desperately look for ways to emulate HDB. In fact, oh, this is where I get really scared. I'd be looking for ways to emulate HDB if I were America too. In fact, the Biden administration has been trying to pass a pilot program that looks pretty Singaporean to me. Just because Singapore seems to have benefited from this program, should that be a reason for the US to emulate it? Well, he says the US should be looking into programs like this as well. Let me take a break here to talk about some of the fallacies here. Is Singapore rich? Sure, yeah, it's definitely rich. Why is Singapore rich? Well, again, he talked about the few points here that it's important. High skilled immigration, speaks English, and got a great education system. But is that really all that it takes? Well, here's one thing I'd like to look at. This is the Heritage Foundation annual rankings of economic freedom. You can say there's different biases in the score, but let's look at it historically. Singapore has always regularly been on top of the freedom index. So this just means general economic freedom for the country or city state country, however you like to define it. And Singapore is always in the top. There seems to be some correlation with economic freedom, as seen here, and relative wealth as described by the author of the previous article. Singapore, Switzerland, Ireland, Taiwan, New Zealand, Estonia, Luxembourg, Netherlands. I think one thing some people might say is, oh, these are all small countries, so they could model the small framework that Noah Pinion is mentioning here. But is that really all it takes to be rich? I would argue that Singapore is wealthy because that they are economically free, not because they've immigrated high skilled, uh, allowed high skilled immigration, not because they have a housing policy where the government owns all the land, but because they have economic freedom for most people to choose their own destiny. And you got a great ability here to compare another country, so I'll pick the United States. Well, here we're looking at 1995 through 2023. I was hoping the red was the United States, but no, it's Singapore. Let's start from 1995. Do we ever get close in this ranking? In fact, it diverges a lot later in, at least most of my adult life. Let's look at property rights. Let's look at property rights. I haven't seen this before. Is there a change? Well, surprisingly, even if the government owns all the land, the Heritage Foundation says Singapore has more property rights or more free in terms of property rights than the United States. Let's assume maybe they don't have figures before this. That's pretty amazing statistic. Is it possible even if the government owns all the land and owns a lot of the housing, you, as a owner, you have more rights to that property than you would in America? I mean, you see it kind of coming together here, so maybe it's an outlier. Let's talk about other signs of freedom. Government spending. Well, even though Singapore owns all that land, why is government spending so much lower than the United States? Could that have an effect on why Singapore is so wealthy. Let's talk about business freedom. Well, maybe this is COVID related, but pretty stark for most of this chart here. Again, most of my adult working life, clear different gaps between the United States and Singapore. Talked about outside investors. Well, it's about the same, I guess. Very different in the early years. I guess you could argue Singapore has been less free. This is probably good. This could be an effect of other countries have increasing their regulations and the US being relatively the same compared to them, perhaps. Financial freedom. I wasn't expecting this. I wonder if there's a description, but okay. Trade freedom. Before I click on this, I'll make a prediction that this should be pretty stark. Let's see it. No, well, maybe here, but Singapore is higher in terms of trade freedom, according to this. Now, I don't have to go through every single point, but my point here is it can't be just bringing in more foreign investment and high skilled immigration. It's about freedom. And that's what Singapore probably does better at than America does. Maybe you can't easily carry a gun, which I'm for. They don't have the Second Amendment protections there like you do in America. They levy a huge tax on cars, which would be devastating for me because I love cars. What about freedom of speech? You definitely don't have the ability to criticize the government, the prime minister. You can't criticize against policies as openly as you can in America. So you do lose out on that. But you have so much more relative economic freedom in Singapore than the United States. Is it worth that trade off? I would prefer to have the freedoms I mentioned that you don't have in Singapore. I think it's important. But economic freedom is just as important. I mean, it is a trade off, but economic freedom is still as important as free speech, right to bear arms. You should be able to dictate what you want to do with your life, what's best for you, and what's best for your friends and family. And every data point here seems to suggest Singapore generally allows that more than the United States. It mentions Ireland should adopt more of Singapore's policies. The UK government, from a lot of estimates I've read, own nearly 10% of all the lands on the island. 10%. What are they doing with that land? That's probably nearly what 5 million, 4 million acres. Let's say you build one house on every acre. 4 million houses, suburban houses that a lot of liberals hate. Low dense, high carbon footprint, single family homes. 4 million 1 acre lots in the UK. Do you think that would help bring down prices? I would be surprised if Ireland doesn't have something similar ratio. I mentioned I went to Ireland this summer, and wow, what a gorgeous place. I rented a car with my wife and packed the 3 kids and the one in the stomach. We drove around the north coast, around Belfast, around some of the Game of Thrones sites. And it's a gorgeous place. Every time you see videos and pictures of Ireland, you see rolling hills and sheep roaming the luscious, I guess you can't call them mountains, hillsides. But there's a lot and lots of land there. Why isn't it being developed? Is it just rich capitalists holding onto the land and preventing people from building homes and apartments and condo high rises? Hmm, I would hardly believe that. In the United States, is that why we don't have affordable housing? Because the government doesn't own it? I can show you. The United States government owns nearly 30% of all the lands in the United States. I've known about this for years, and I'm surprised a lot of people don't know this. And they're always surprised when I bring it up. 30%. Have you seen a map? Let me show you a map of what that 30% looks like. That's nearly all this red here. 600 plus million acres. Nevada. Oh, California, huh? I've lived in San Diego, Irvine. It's an expensive place. You think if some of this red was sold away, housing prices would be a little cheaper? Wouldn't be perfect, but sure is a lot of land that the federal government owns in California. Arizona, people always think Arizona is a free, conservative, segregationist state, and there's a little bit of that there. But look, vast majority, over 50% is owned by the federal government. Utah, conservative Mormon Utah. They got this little white sliver that the federal government doesn't own. Be surprised if this state doesn't own it. In liberal Oregon, that's very few pieces of land that they own. In Washington, this all this red right across Seattle. It's got to be driving up the price there too. No, what are they doing? Is the federal government building condos there and public housing? They're not doing it now. Can't help notice good old Texas. Texas has its own land use problems, but yeah, relative to every large major state, I can't complain about the freedom you have with land ownership in Texas. I am a little surprised by Hawaii. I would have thought there's a lot more ownership. I think I'll have to look at that a bit more. But yeah, the federal government already owns a lot of the land, and I'm sure this author knows it. So what's to say that the government would change? He also mentions about how he would design roads, and I'm not a fan of too much central planning in this sort of sense. I would say if I was going to be Pete Buttigieg for about a year and dictate anything from transportation, the US could definitely use more roundabouts. I love roundabouts. I've been sold it. I visited the UK a lot for my work, and man, just makes so much sense. But I digress. But yeah, this is just typical. Well, I don't want to be demeaning. It's not. I would say typical, but it's a lot of same arguments that liberal, well-educated PhD economists often say. We just need better government management of X, and we will get a wonderful result Y. Look at this example like Singapore. Look at this example like Ireland. That's not what we need. Yes, it works on paper, but you're not getting to the root cause of why these successes happen. They're attributed to freedom. What Singapore needs is more freedom if they want to get cheaper housing. But my goal is not to talk about Singapore, it's to talk about America. You want America to look a little more like Singapore? Let's start with the Freedom Index. Let's get our rating closer to Singapore. And I would promise you, we would look a lot more like the beautiful parts of Singapore you talk about here. You will see New York City grow with even more skyscrapers, with solar panels on top of trees, on top of patios. You'll see a San Francisco cleaned up with the homeless, the houseless living in better conditions. You'll see Nevadas. Could you imagine a renaissance of Nevada in the desert? Another Las Vegas? I think Nevadans have that spirit. And the people from LA and San Francisco that escaped to Las Vegas, I think they would be willing to build a Las Vegas part two. Imagine freeing that up, all that land. I just have to share that again. Maybe I'll link to my Substack article where I talk a little bit about this. Nevada is completely covered. Surface and subsurface federal ownership. And you've heard the stories. How easy is it to buy the land managed by the federal government? It's pretty next to impossible. What do? They give you rights. You can get leases to drill for oil or explore for oil. You can get leases to graze your cattle or other animals. Why do you need permission from the government? Because they own it. Why does the government own it? They shouldn't own it. It needs to be going into more productive hands. And you can imagine some people might convert the Grand Canyon into a better Grand Canyon, meaning still keep its beauty, but maybe enhanced experience. You're not going to get that with federal bureaucrats. I will say, however, of all the agencies I would cut, it would probably be the last thing I would focus on. I mean, every experience I've had at these national parks that I can remember in my young adult life, it's been great. Great service. It's fee based, so most of the time you do pay a fee. And I think that's a great feedback loop because you have revenue. It's probably being undercharged, but you have revenue to justify some of the services that they are providing. So you want more? You want America to look more like Singapore? Let's work to increase our economic freedom index. Let's get back into the top 5. How can the United States not be number 1? We were the shining example of economic freedom and liberty almost 300 years ago. What happened? What happened? Thanks. Talk to you guys next time.